battle has been joined.
Hi, my name is Gery, and this is the first installment of my three-part video series on how the United States lost the Persian Gulf War. Yes, you heard me correctly. Back in January and February of 1991, the U.S. and its coalition allies suffered a major strategic defeat to Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis. Now, this video series will lay out conclusive evidence of that defeat, and will also offer up many other important bits about the war you might not have heard. Much of the material for this series is derived from my 2017 book, Debacle, The Persian Gulf War Revealed. This three-part set comes complete with dozens of video links to actual battlefield footage from the war, and is currently available on Amazon in both regular and ebook format. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy part one of Debacle, How the United States Lost the Persian Gulf War. On August 2nd, 1990, at just after 6 o'clock in the morning, thousands of Iraqi combat troops began moving across the southern Iraqi border into Kuwait. 8 divisions of the Republican Guard, or 100,000 men, along with 1,000 or more tanks, quickly egressed from 4 different directions into the tiny Gulf Emirate that sat atop 10% of the world's known oil reserves. Shortly thereafter, 96 Iraqi transport helicopters brought more troops toward Kuwait City, the capital, and other strategic points, while 100 or more combat jets went after Kuwait's air assets, many of which were still on the ground. By 9 a.m., Iraqi forces had overcome limited opposition and entered the capital in force, where they joined up with troops already landed by the helos. By 10 a.m., a huge battle was raging at the Emir's palace, with Kuwaiti guards and soldiers trying in vain to hold out against much larger numbers. By the end of August 2nd, practically all of Kuwait was in Iraqi control, and hundreds of thousands of Kuwaiti civilians and other nationals then living in the country were anxiously fleeing south, making their way across the desert into Saudi Arabia. Iraq had serious reasons for invading its southern Gulf neighbor. Kuwait's government had been actively calling in loans to Iraq made in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War, loans thought by most observers as a kind of gift for Iraq spending so many lives fighting off the Iranians. The Kuwaitis were also stealing Iraqi oil by slant drilling under the border into the Iraqi section of the disputed Rumaila oil field. Perhaps most damaging of all, Kuwait had been overproducing oil for almost 2 years, driving down the international price for fuel and wreaking havoc on the Iraqi economy, still recovering from the war with Iran. As stated by Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz in a post-invasion interview, we were now desperate and could not pay our bills for food imports. It was a starvation war. When do you use your military power to preserve yourself? Iraq will not become a beggar state. We are a dignified people with a 5,000-year-old civilization. We saw a conspiracy to bring about the economic collapse of Iraq, followed by its political collapse and a change of regime. This was more threatening to us than an attack by Israel, against which we could retaliate. We had to challenge this conspiracy. We tried until August 1st to settle this matter without force, and then we acted. In Washington, D.C., Iraq's invasion triggered a set of comprehensive reactions by the White House. At the direction of President George H.W. Bush, an American boycott of all Iraqi and Kuwaiti goods was immediately ordered. A joint statement with the Soviet Union condemning the invasion was also put forward. President Bush himself took to the phones, calling other world leaders to line up support for economic pressure on Baghdad, and to make the case that, one way or another, the world community could not tolerate Iraq's invasion. Over the next 3 weeks, the State Department, under the direction of Secretary of State James Baker, was able to secure a vote of condemnation at the United Nations Security Council, as well as a demand for immediate Iraqi withdrawal, as reflected in UN Resolution 660. Behind the scenes, the Bush administration was taking even more steps against Iraq. The Kuwaiti emir, who had just barely escaped his country in time, was assured the United States would go to great lengths to remove the Iraqis from his country and place him and his family back in control. In the first 2 weeks after Iraq's invasion, the U.S. military spent considerable time talking about and planning all of the options to deal with the crisis. As pointed out by General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, the head of CENTCOM, or United States Central Command, that part of the U.S. military, charged with the area of the Middle East, the Iraqi military was a very large force, with over 900,000 men under arms, 5,700 main battle tanks, 10,000 armored personnel carriers, 3,500 pieces of artillery, scores of chemical weapon stocks, 200 or more Scud missiles, and between 700 and 800 combat aircraft. For the White House and the Pentagon, one of the most critical aspects in preparing for a military clash with Iraq was getting the government of Saudi Arabia on board. To secure their consent, the Bush administration sent Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, Under-Secretary of Defense for Planning Paul Wolfowitz, along with General Schwarzkopf and a host of other military brass, to Saudi Arabia to try and convince a highly reluctant King Fahd to accept U.S. troops to defend his kingdom. This was a major gambit, as there was no hard proof that Saddam Hussein was fixing to move his men further south toward critical Saudi oil installations. Scouts from the Saudi military could find no trace of Iraqis gearing up for another move. But Schwarzkopf and the others maintained that the threat was real, and that U.S. troops had to come now or it would be too late later. In the end, after 6 hours of warnings and predictions about the danger to his kingdom, Fahd relented to the pressure, asking Dick Cheney, "The only thing I want to know is whether at the end of this, Saddam Hussein will be able to pick himself up off the floor." The ultra-confident Cheney responded, "No." Back in Washington, President Bush had signed an explicit order for the CIA to take covert action to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Concurrent with this, an organized demonization campaign against Iraq's president was started by supporters of the president in Congress, as well as like-minded journalists in the American media. Soon, statements and images in the press pulled few punches in their negative characterizations of Iraq's president. Saddam Hussein was a bloodthirsty madman, said the New York Post. A do-it-my-way-or-die ruler, echoed a Boston Globe editorial. U.S. News and World Report, a weekly journal headed by the highly pro-Israel Mortimer Zuckerman, pronounced Saddam as the most dangerous man in the world. The New Republic magazine, a publication also highly supportive of Israeli policy in the Middle East, put out a cover photo of Saddam doctored with a mustache to make him look akin to Adolf Hitler. To keep the entire executive branch of government on the same page regarding the Kuwait crisis, the President put forward National Security Directive 45, entitled U.S. Policy in Response to the Iraqi Invasion of Kuwait. Such national security directives, sometimes called presidential directives, are classified documents and not to be confused with executive orders, such as President Trump's travel ban on select countries in 2017. Ever since the end of World War II, American presidents had utilized secret national security directives, by whatever name, to lead their respective teams on a matter deemed critical to national security. In practically all cases, these edicts were carried out to the letter by the presidential staffs and/or the military. In 1947, President Truman signed National Security Council 1-1, authorizing covert action in the Italian elections to fend off possible encroachment by the Communist Party. In 1961, JFK authorized National Security Action Memoranda 104 to develop plans for possible action in Vietnam. In 1981, Jimmy Carter set forth the document National Security Council 63, establishing a Persian Gulf security framework for building up our own capabilities to project force into the region while maintaining a credible presence there. 2 years later, President Reagan added National Security Directive 114, calling for the United States policy to undertake whatever measures may be necessary to keep the vital Strait of Hormuz, where much of Persian Gulf oil traversed, safe from Iranian interference and completely open to international shipping. In 1989, President Bush set out his own administration's first policy guideline on the Gulf region with National Security Directive 26, saying, "The United States should propose economic and political incentives for Iraq so to moderate its behavior and to increase our influence." But in August of 1990, after Iraq had moved aggressively on a neighboring state, the Bush administration's new directive maintained quite a different tone, calling for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces and a freeze on Kuwaiti and Iraqi assets in the U.S. NSD 45 also ordered U.S. military forces deployed to the region for two purposes. One, to deter and, if necessary, defend Saudi Arabia and other friendly states in the Gulf region from further Iraqi aggression, and to enforce UN sanctions by searching all shipping coming into Iraq or Kuwait. In the weeks and months that followed, as American ground troops began heading out to the Desert Kingdom, the U.S. Navy and that of Britain and other nations patrolled the waters of the Persian Gulf, spotting and boarding any ships with goods bound for or coming from Iraq or Kuwait. Throughout September and October of 1990, the U.S.-led coalition buildup in Saudi Arabia continued on a massive scale. The entire 7th Corps, over 50,000 men and scores of tanks and other heavy armor, arrived from Germany via ship. Hundreds of jet fighters, bombers, and armed helicopters flew in from bases all over the world. Vast stocks of ammunition, supplies, support vehicles, food, water, medical equipment, and every other conceivable item to sustain a major war arrived night and day by the boat or plane load. Back in the States, the demonization campaign against Saddam and the Iraqis continued apace. At one point, members of the press heard fake testimony that Iraqi soldiers had abandoned newborn Kuwaiti infants at a hospital.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The first time, I think, when the American people were focused on what was happening to the Kuwaiti citizens at the hands of the Iraqi soldiers.
Is the time to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait.
Dr. David Chu is a biomedical engineer at British Columbia Institute of Technology. He was assigned by the World Health Organization to go to Kuwait last May to assess the damage to medical equipment. He visited all facilities from operating rooms to maternity wards, expecting a lot more damage than he found.
I felt I was lied to. I was quite surprised to see the large number of infant incubators there. So I asked the person who was guiding us what happened, whether the story we were told was true or not. It said the taking of incubators away had not occurred.
Dr. Ian Pollock took pictures too, investigating the incubator story for London-based Physicians for Human Rights.
In one situation, I found a pediatrician who was willing to tell me off the record that he knew of this story. He also felt it was not true, but also felt that it was being spread by some people for their own reasons as, if you like, misinformation.
22 premature babies. They all died, and then they shot the hospital employees. And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well.
She seemed to be alone before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus identified only as a Kuwaiti escapee. But we've discovered she wasn't alone at all. And she wasn't just a simple Kuwaiti escapee. In fact, just a few seats away was her father, Kuwait's ambassador to the United States and Canada. Naira quickly slipped out of the caucus hearing, back into the protective folds of her family, the extended royal family of Kuwait, headed by the Emir Jabir al-Sabah.
By November, the Bush administration had settled on Iraq's nuclear weapons program, still in the development phase, as a lightning rod issue to bring the public on board for war.
I'm deeply concerned about Saddam's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
Iraq disputed the logic of the exaggerated claims, reminding everyone that it was the United States that had actually used nuclear weapons against civilian targets in Japan during World War II. By November 29th, the United Nations Security Council had passed Resolution 678, allowing for, quote, all necessary means, unquote, to be used to secure Kuwait from Iraqi forces if they did not withdraw by January 15th of the following year.
The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 678, 1990.
A few weeks later, U.S. opinion polls showed over 50% of the public now supported war, up from the teens when the Kuwait crisis first started. By early January 1991, the campaign of lies and exaggerations about Iraq had convinced a majority of Congress to go along with the White House's plans for war. On January 9th, Secretary of State James Baker met for talks in Geneva, Switzerland, with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz.
If there is a genuine, sincere, serious intention to make peace in the whole region of the Middle East, we are ready to reciprocate. When I went to meet with James Baker, I hadn't the slightest idea that that meeting would succeed. I knew that that was public relations, that he wanted to tell the Congress, look, to the end I tried to find a diplomatic settlement so that he could get few more votes.
For several hours, the two men and their entourages conversed and jostled about not just the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, but a host of other regional issues, especially Israel's 24-year-old illegal occupation of Arab territory. When retired James Baker finally approached the lectern as the first to speak, he was direct about the talk's apparent failure.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever.
It is not an option for the Congress of the United States to disapprove what we for months have asked others to support.
I see no compelling reason to rush to military action. Of course, there are no guarantees on economic sanctions. There are also no guarantees on war. Where are the guarantees on war?
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 47.
We would not have won the vote without Geneva. We simply wouldn't. In the aftermath of the Geneva meeting, opposition to our use of force eroded. So,
on the military side, General Schwarzkopf now felt it to be the right time to announce to the press how the pending attack on Iraq would focus on Iraq's three centers of gravity. 1, President Hussein himself. 2, the Republican Guards in southern Iraq. And 3, Iraq's non-conventional weapons programs. It doesn't take a genius, Schwarzkopf said, to figure out that if those three things are gone, his ability to wage war is to all intents and purposes finished. Finally, during the early evening of January 15th, a day and a half before Schwarzkopf's team at CENTCOM were scheduled to unleash their highly scripted barrage, President Bush approved and signed National Security Directive 54. Likely written by National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and Middle East Advisor Richard Haass, NSD 54, responding to Iraqi aggression in the Gulf, would serve as the overall guiding document for the war for the White House. It included the following 10 military goals for the campaign. Defend Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Cooperation Council states against attack. Preclude Iraqi launch of ballistic missiles against neighboring states and friendly forces. Destroy Iraq's chemical, biological, and nuclear capabilities. Destroy Iraq's command, control, and communication capabilities. Eliminate the Republican Guards as an effective fighting force. Conduct operations designed to drive Iraq's forces from Kuwait. Break the will of Iraqi forces. Discourage Iraqi use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. Encourage defection of Iraqi forces. And weaken Iraqi popular support for the current government. All members of Bush's cabinet were then given a copy of NSD 54, including the highest-ranking member of the military, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Colin Powell. Back in Iraq's capital, Baghdad, Saddam Hussein appeared none too worried about the massive forces heading his way, at one point saying, "It is not Kuwait they want, it is me they want. I am the defiant spirit. But I say to them, before you feed on me, I will feed on you." On January 17th, at 2:38 a.m. Gulf time, the Persian Gulf War officially began. American Apache helicopters were the first to strike. They successfully took out elements of Iraq's early warning radar system on the Saudi-Iraq border, clearing a safe path for hundreds of fighters and bombers flying high on the way to Baghdad, Basra, and other major Iraqi cities, as well as key Republican Guard positions in southern Iraq. Would the U.S. and its coalition partners have success in accomplishing the clear set of objectives that Schwarzkopf and others had stated? Would the military goals, as listed in NSD 54, be attained, comprising victory for the U.S. side? Or would the stubborn and wily Saddam Hussein and his vast army thwart the U.S. and attain a strategic victory? By refusing to leave Kuwait and adhere to the UN sanctions, Saddam had defied much of the world, but more directly, had stood down the United States and its military establishment. Now, the reputation of the entire U.S. military was on the line, as well as the credibility of President Bush and his administration. With hundreds of U.S. planes closing in on Baghdad and practically the whole world watching via CNN, Who would actually come out ahead in this first major conflict in the post-Cold War period? Stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 of Debacle, How the U.S. Lost the Persian Gulf War, to find out.